Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think it's time for us to begin. Welcome. My name is Marlène Laruelle. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at GW and the co-director of PONARS Eurasia with my colleague Henry Hell. This monthly seminar, New Voices on Russia, aims at bringing to Washington, D.C. a new generation of scholars working on Russia to kind of counter the usual narrative that we have in Washington, D.C., that we are lacking scholars on Russia and expertise on Russia, and the goal is to show that no, on the contrary, there is really a blossoming generation of research done on contemporary Russia that is both academic and also has a policy relevance. And that's what we will be seeing today with our guest, and I'm very happy to have him here, Arturas Rozenas, who is Assistant Professor of Politics at New York University, and who will be discussing the politics of information manipulation, and who has been doing research on state-controlled media in Russia since several years. So Arturas, welcome. We're very happy to have you here, and I give you the floor.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Marlene. Thanks for your introduction. Thanks for inviting me here, and thanks everyone for coming in this afternoon. I understand that I'm competing for attention with Michael Cohen, and so these are quite big shoes to fill. Hopefully it's going to be worth it. So today I'm going to be talking about the politics of information manipulation in the case of state-controlled media in Russia. And what essentially I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be summarizing and describing some of the research that me and my colleagues have been doing on this topic since about 2014. Okay, so my talk will consist of three sections. So the first section, I'm going to be talking about the topic of manipulation of economic news on Russian state-controlled media. Then I will talk about the political effects of Russian media, especially political effects when it comes to international affairs. Okay, so these first two sections of the talk are going to be based on the actual systematic, rigorous research that me and my colleagues have done over the last 5 years. And then I'm going to conclude in the third part with more sort of speculative thoughts that I have about the nature of what I call Putin's informational autocracy and its international impact. Okay, so let me start with the first topic, manipulation of economic news. So many scholars said this is not my observation. But many scholars have noted the following interesting patterns, which is that if you look at the autocratic leaders of modern age, especially the ones that are ruling sort of after the Cold War, one notices the following pattern, that is, if in the past autocrats tend to rely a lot on ideology, very heavy propaganda, and state repression, modern autocrats do not do that as a matter of rule, or do not do that to the degree that the historical autocrats used to be doing that. And when people discuss this theory of new, modern, informational autocrats, usually Putin's regime comes as one of the first examples of that type of regime. And the most important feature of those regimes is that the ruler is really trying to signal and create the vision that he is the competent economic manager. And that if he is to survive in office, he should survive in office on the merit of being competent economic manager. Okay, that's the idea. And hence you have this coverage across media internationally everywhere, right? Talking about competence of different political leaders. This didn't used to happen historically to the degree that is happening right now. So, but then the natural question occurs, and that was the question that motivated our research, which is, okay, so if you position yourself as someone who is in charge of economic affairs and someone who is a competent economic manager, what do you do if the inevitable arrives? What do you do if economy goes down? How do you reconcile two things together? Yourself being a competent economic manager and economic downturn. And a natural instinctual reaction would have been, right, in a country like Russia, where the state has a lot of impact on what the media says and doesn't say, the instinct would be, well, bad economic news should be censored and should not be made available to citizens. Of course, we know that according to Putin, this will never happen. According to Putin, there is no, and there has never been, censorship of any kind in Russia. So what we did in this research, the first step in this research, we decided to check whether Putin is actually right and to what degree he's right when he's describing this. So what did we do? So now, just to make it very clear, I'm going to be focusing almost exclusively on the coverage of economic news, given that it is a very important topic for modern type of autocrats as Putin. So how do we do it? So we decided to check this proposition whether economic news are censored in Russia using a huge database of daily news transcripts from Russia's first Channel 1, the largest state-owned, majority share-owned TV channel. And so what we did, we collected daily news transcripts going from 1991 to 2016. So that is every news report that had been produced on that channel. We collected all of them. And then we used many different methodological computational techniques in trying to identify and measure the degree of censorship. Now, censorship is a difficult thing to measure, because in order to figure out that something is censored, somehow you have to figure out that the fact happened, and you have to be able to measure that fact without relying on media itself. So we had to do some work, and I'm sort of not going to go to all the details of that work, but I would like to explain to you how exactly did we measure the degree of economic censorship on Russian media. And so we relied on the following theorizing about the process of news coverage. And this theorizing is, we think, largely uncontroversial because it relies on very basic principles. So let's think about the following. Let's think about x-axis as being the range of news, and ranging from very, very bad news that are neither good nor bad, like not really important news, and then very good news. Okay, very good news are very important, very bad news are very important, news in the middle are probably less important. And on the y-axis, we have the intensity of coverage of those news on the media. So now, the thinking here is, if you have a media source that is completely neutral, the incentives over there, right, the incentive for the media is always to sell news, to draw attention. So the incentive is always going to be, well, we would like to cover news that are very important at higher intensity. Whether those news are bad news or good news, those are big news, and big news should be reported more than small news. Okay, so this is the model that one would have of the neutral media source. Of course, this is not really a description of what we could call Western American or Western European media source, because there has been some research about these coverage symmetries and asymmetries, and people have found the following, that, well, bad news sell more, and therefore bad news are really over-reported in Western media relative to good news. So there are certain asymmetries, but those asymmetries in Western media are really of specific type, that bad news are over-reported relative to good news. On the other hand, if the news are censored, right, in a way that would favor the government, we would actually observe the opposite pattern to that of the Western news, which is, we would observe asymmetric coverage, but it would be asymmetric in favor of the good news. That is, bad news would be underreported relative to good news. Okay, so that was our idea of how we can start thinking about measuring systematically censorship. Again, I want to emphasize, we can find facts and show, right, that these facts were not reported in Russian media, but what we want to do a systematic, reproducible research of this thing. So we're not cherry-picking facts, we're just doing large data analysis here. Okay, so what we did then, we said, okay, let's take 4, because we were able to find 4, economic indicators that we can measure more or less objectively. Okay, objectively and in sufficiently high frequency. And then let's see how news on those economic indicators are covered in Russian media, whether there are asymmetries, and whether those asymmetries are consistent with the red graph, with the red curve, I'm sorry. Okay? The idea being that if the data are consistent with the red curve, then we have censorship. And so what we did, we collected data on 4 economic indicators. We collected data on the daily change of the Moscow Stock Exchange, right? Big changes, big improvements on a given day is good news. Big downturns in stock market, bad news. Data on the ruble and US dollar exchange rate. Again, that is an economic statistic that is very highly salient in everyday life in Russia. The oil price of Brent crude price, also the daily change. And finally, the monthly change in the consumer price index, which is so consistently across all surveys, inflation continues to be one of the most important economic topics for Russian population. And again, big increases in consumer price index are bad news, right? And drop in the consumer price index is good news. And so now what we're doing, for each of those 4 indicators, we're going to see whether the coverage of those indicators is actually symmetric, whether good news on each of those 4 indicators is covered with the same frequency as bad news. So let's see let's see what we get. Okay, so this graph now, what it shows the coverage so on the x-axis you have daily returns in the Moscow Stock Exchange. Again, if you go this direction, these are increasingly good news. That means the stock market grew on a given day by a lot. These are increasingly bad news. That means the stock market dropped down considerably on that given day. And here, not many things have happened, so it's not worth reporting them, right? Because small fluctuations are not that worth reporting. So what we observe is generally it is consistent that news at in the middle are covered with much less intensity than news at the extreme. But we actually do not see any asymmetries. We do not see that bad news would be underreported relative to good news. In other words, if the stock market goes up by 5 points, the intensity with which that fact is reported on Russian media is pretty much the same if the stock market goes down by 5 points. Okay, and so on. You can do that calculation for any other number, and you get pretty similar, what we call pretty similar predicted coverage. Make sense? So we don't observe, at least on this count. So let's look at all the 4 indicators for which we have data, and we observe something very, very similar. So if we look at the ruble-US dollar exchange rate, again, high exchange rate means the ruble is becoming cheap relative to dollar. These are bad news. These are good news. Again, we see a very symmetric coverage. We don't see any asymmetries that would indicate censorship. If we look at oil price, again, we see very, very symmetric coverage. And most interestingly now, if you look at the monthly change at the consumer price index, in fact you see asymmetries, but those asymmetries are not favoring the hypothesis of censorship. In other words, the bigger is monthly change increase in the consumer price index, the worse news it is for Russian government, but those news are reported with higher frequency than bad news. Okay? So whichever way we look, and we did additional tests in our work on this, in our publication that is which is forthcoming in 2 months. Okay, we didn't really find detectable evidence that news would be distorted in a way that would indicate censorship. So in some sense, at least when it comes to this issue, Putin was right. We don't have too much evidence of censorship. Now here's another possibility. Of course, you could ask, look, what you're telling us here is that the media actually spoke about consumer price index, but you didn't tell us how the media spoke about consumer price index. It's possible that they didn't censor the news about consumer prices, but in fact they could misrepresent the news. In other words, they could lie about the real change in prices, or they could lie about the ruble-US dollar exchange rate. And we checked for that, and we also don't find any evidence. So what we show here on this graph, we compile data from all 4 indicators, and then we arrange it from how negative the indicator is and how positive the indicator is. And then I'm not going to go to the methodology. We measure the sentiment of news related to each of those indicators. And so what we observe here, that these are very, very highly correlated, which means that if an indicator was really, really bad, the Russian media was covering with the negative sentiment. So when the news were bad, they spoke about bad news, and they spoke about bad news as bad news. They did not distort them. So we couldn't find evidence for either censorship or distortion of economic news. Okay, so this was interesting sort of moment for our project, because we came up with this idea to measure censorship, and then we come and test it and we don't find any. It was difficult sort of to see what to do with this. And so we started thinking again about this. We started thinking, okay, so what is actually going on? So what is going on, right? Because we know that political news on Russian media are routinely censored. We have stuff like this going all the time. Political events of which we know, like protests, right, which people can measure now without relying on the state media, right? They are consistently underreported, right, especially if they are anti-regime protests. Corruption in the government is consistently not reported, not even underreported, right? And the Russian government is not really shy about this. They have censored thousands and thousands of web pages and blogs. And if you go to a web page that is censored by Russian government, it will tell you it's been censored. This is what you're going to get. You're going to see that, well, you cannot access this page because it's now banned according to the law. I think it's always something about extremism and propagation of extreme ideas. That's nothing specific to Russia. The propagation of extreme ideas since Napoleon, that was the justification for censorship. Okay, so what is happening? So why not the same with economic news? And so then we thought about it before, it kind of makes sense. It makes sense from the following perspective, that economic news are really, citizens can observe a lot of economic fundamentals in the way they cannot observe political fundamentals, right? In other words, well, if I live in a city, right, where protests didn't happen, I will not be able to know what the protest has happened in another city without the media. But if I go to grocery store and I see that prices are increasing, there's no way that the media is going to convince me by saying that the prices are actually decreasing, right? If my salary is going down, there's no amount of media that is going to prove to me that incomes are increasing, right? So people have some independent traction when it comes to economic fundamentals, and so what we argue is that it restricts the ability of the state to censor effectively, right? Because then you create this possibility that if you lie about economic fundamentals, if you distort that information, right, it can backfire if people can actually, right, if people can calibrate it against their own personal experiences of the economy. So this led us to think in the following way. Led us to think the following idea. Well, what is the point of manipulating information of this kind? What is actually the purpose? And the purpose of manipulating of information of this kind to start with, right, is to prove that your reputation is good, even if the economy is doing bad. And to prove that your reputation is good when the economy is doing good. So really what really matters, right, from that angle, from that perspective, is not what the facts on the ground are, is how those facts on the ground are actually related to the competence ability and ability of leader. So based on that insight, then we developed this idea that there could be another overlooked model, another overlooked mechanism of news manipulation, which we call selective attribution. And it's nothing too original here. We're not claiming this, but here's the basic idea, is that you do not manipulate facts, especially facts that citizens can themselves independently observe on the ground, but you manipulate the causal interpretation of the fact. To put it in a very blunt terms, and this is a bit too blunt, if it's good news, good economic news, it should be because of Putin. If it's bad, it should be because of somebody else, right? This is how you save your reputation in bad economic times. And the reason why that could be effective is that to prove the manipulation of selective attribution is much more difficult than to prove that you actually manipulated facts. And to show that case, let me use example of, and let me just say, this idea is really as old as humanity. One of the most fundamental biases of human cognition is the bias of selective attribution. When good things happen to us, we say, well, this is because we really worked very hard. When bad things happen to us, we say, well, we were very, very unlucky. And in fact, even the most disciplined minds of our generation cannot resist this temptation, right? So this is the example, right? So Trump has multiple examples of this selective attribution. You can read this, but here's like how I would think about this. So he says, okay, business is looking better than ever, with business enthusiasm at record levels. This is provable fact. And it's true at the moment of time when he's saying that. It's true. Stock market at an all-time high. This is true, and you can prove it's true. If he would lie, you could disprove it. You could disprove it, right? But here's the point, which is very hard to prove or disprove. That doesn't just happen. Okay? Try to prove that this is because of Trump. Or try to prove that this is not because of Trump. You can argue about this, but it's going to be much more difficult to nail it down. Right? So there's always going to be some room for ambiguity when you make an argument about selective attribution. And much more ambiguity and much more room for maneuver than if you manipulate facts themselves, if you manipulate the raw facts. So let me give you examples from the media itself. Okay, so this is example of attribution of good news. So blah, blah, blah. So there were, Kremlin met with some, Putin met with some people at Kremlin, some representatives of the teachers' union, and he heard many complaints that working retirees receive low pensions. That's a bad thing. That's a bad fact. Working retirees receive low pensions. Pensions is a sensitive topic. And here's now the thing, right? Here's now the attribution. The president promised to sort out the situation, and here's a positive fact. Now we have a result. Working pensioners will receive higher payments. Okay, so we have bad news that are not attributed to anyone. We have good news. Wages are going to increase, and those good news are attributed to Putin. It's a direct causal attribution, cause and effect statement. And this is my favorite. So this is actually how early it began. This is, the fall of 2000. So here's the statement. Today, due to sharp decline in market quotes, trading in the Russian trading system was stopped. Now look at the discontinuity here. in the US. Okay, George Bush and Al Gore continue to battle in the courts, blah, blah, blah. The uncertainty about the outcome of the US presidential election, after all, was reflected in the stock markets. Indeed, not so much in the American markets as in the Russian ones. Okay? Again, there's an event, and there's a very clear attribution why that event happened. It did not happen because of what is happening in the Russian government. It happened because of uncertainty related to US elections. And here's a more subtle way of doing the same thing. So this is what we call attribution by association. So here, the example is, again, you have a good event. The inflation in 2009 will be 13% lower than previous forecasts. And this was said in the meeting with the Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. You didn't need to say this thing. You didn't need to say that you didn't need to report that event in the context of meeting with Vladimir Putin, but Vladimir Putin is mentioned in that context. So now you can create this selective attribution by association. So there is no clear causal argument that Putin caused it, right? But Putin is mentioned in the context of good news. So what do we try to do? We try to see, well, is this actually systematic? Is it happening on a systematic basis? I don't have time to, so 90% of my work on this project was figuring out how to measure this thing systematically, how to measure the degree of selective attribution. I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to give you results. Okay, so we found a way combining a lot of Russian speaker and coders of text and machine learning tools, computational tools to measure selective attribution. You will have to believe me, okay? For now. If you're interested, there's a whole paper on that. Okay, I'm just going to be talking about results. So let's look at the results. So now this graph is showing how news are attributed to Vladimir Putin from 1999 to 2016. So how to read this graph? If the news are good, there's about 25% chance that those news are going to be attributed to Putin. Okay? So quarter of all good news get attributed to Putin. If the news are bad, it's not exactly zero, but in statistical language, we say we cannot reject the hypothesis that 0% of news were attributed to Putin. Okay, so our best statistical estimate is that the 0% of news were attributed to Putin in the entire range of 17 years, directly. Now, what happens if we ask how news are attributed to foreign economies? So usually these like global economic affairs or economic events in the United States, European Union, etc. Okay, so over 30% of bad economic news are attributed to foreign economy, and about 5% of good news are attributed to foreign economy. You see the switch? You see how bars switch once we go from attribution to Putin to attribution to foreign economy? And something similar happens when we talk about attribution to foreign powers. About 15% of bad news attributed to foreign powers, usually that's in the United States with some exceptions. And about 5% of good news attributed to the actions of foreign powers. Again, so we see this flip, right? That there is if we put all of these three results together, right, we see how there's one pattern when it comes to Putin, and with this similar analysis for other Russian officials, this also looks very similar. And here, how it goes if we go to foreign powers and foreign economy. And we looked at how these things actually change in time. So what this graph shows the proportion of bad news attributed to Putin red. So you see it stayed flat because it was zero all the time. Statistically, zero. It's not exactly zero. There are some, but statistically we cannot reject the zero. And so this is how the proportion of good news fluctuated across the Putin's reign. So it really started sort of a bit innocuously, right? And then start doing this thing, but every time there is these vertical bars are elections. So basically every time there is an election, you have a peak, except in 2008 when Putin is not running for presidential office. At each other point, there is a little peak as to how many of these news are attributed to Putin, so there is a political logic behind it, which makes sense. We looked at the foreign powers, so when does it happen? So again, the discourse that foreign powers are responsible for malfunctioning of certain aspects of Russian economy sort of started around 2005. Before that, we don't see any evidence. And of course, some of it is very obvious. Some of it is just sanctions that are happening after Crimea, right? So this is pretty obvious. And so final dynamics here about the foreign economy. So some of it is very well justified. So this is the global financial crisis, obviously, that's justified. There's nothing here. But it's also very interesting that the other peak of attribution of bad news to foreign economy happened around the time of post-election protests in 2011-12. And then of course, so this is Crimea. Okay, so what are the lessons of this? So the lesson here, the first lesson that we drew is that censorship is less dominant than expected. And it sort of draws attention to this, underlines this fact that, anecdotally we could find evidence of censorship. But that's the whole point, is if we try to scale it up and do this thing systematically, a very different pattern emerges. So it's really one can arrive at the wrong conclusion relying on intuition and anecdotes here. So economic news are manipulated through selective attribution, and so biased interpretation of facts is harder to disprove, as we argue, and that's the reason it is used. And so an interesting implication here is that we know in political science that if economy is doing bad, leaders tend to also do bad. But here we sort of argue that there's a way to mitigate that effect of bad economy if you can successfully manipulate the nature of news through this particular channel. Okay, so my second part of my talk is going to be about political effects of Russian media. So in other words, we ask the question, well, does it actually work? So if it manipulates news in different ways, and that's not the only way that we document it, other domestic effects. So I'm not going to talk about domestic effects because there's a lot of research done by economists showing that indeed people who are exposed to Russian media tend to vote more for United Russia and for Putin, etc. And there's a lot of good research on that. I'm going to focus on the work that we did, which is about the international effects of Russian media, with a focus on Ukraine. So this graph shows how frequently Channel 1 in Russia was covering topics related to Ukraine. Right, so these are weekly mentions of Ukraine from 2009 to 2016. So what we see, of course, is kind of fairly obvious that until Maidan, you have this sort of a little bit of spikes around Ukrainian elections, right? But after Maidan, the whole thing spikes, and after Crimea spikes again. So what you have a lot of coverage of Ukrainian affairs on Russian media. And in fact, we checked in some days, for example, if you know the Sunday program on Channel 1, Vremya, which is the most popular news channel in Russia, right? Sometimes we saw that about 75% of news on Vremya were actually devoted to Ukraine. So there's a lot of heavy coverage of Ukraine. And from a social science perspective and from a human perspective, it was interesting for the following reason, is that when it came to Ukraine, the bias in Russian media was extremely conspicuous. So I have the slide from RT, which is not exactly Channel 1, but I just wanted to have it in English, but I could find many examples like this in Russian as well, right? Like, so Poroshenko is described junta's first two bills in parliament legalize Nazi education, ban minority politicians and languages. Okay, so it's very sort of hardcore, sort of hard-coded language without too much subtlety. And of course we had other interesting deviations, right? The woman telling a story from Donbass region about how Ukrainian forces are crucifying children, and how seeing children just being killed is sort of like a good way that Ukrainian authorities deal with people, because there are many more cruel ways that they do that. And of course I also like how they covered many of the international affairs, right? So here's the interesting projection that was occurring all the time, right? Like so Putin here is in the front, and of course he's bigger, and he has 78% support, and Obama is of course much smaller, and he has a 45% support, right? All these things happening, and of course, in 2014 it sort of escalated with the nuclear thing, which actually started happening again just a few days ago. So this is Kiselov, one of the main sort of anchors on Russian television, talking about how Russia could turn U.S. into the nuclear ashes. Again, these narratives have resurfaced recently. So from social science perspective, it's really interesting, because we tend to think that if information is conspicuously biased, if you sort of say, well, I'm selling a thing, right? I'm trying to prove the point and I have interest in proving the point, people will tend to discount that information, right? And so we try to see, well, does that actually work? And the way we did it, we studied a particular region in northeastern Ukraine. We took 3 regions in northeastern Ukraine. And the reason we did that, because we exploited the following sort of natural experiment, is that after Crimea, Ukraine has banned the broadcast of Russian television on cable. But these people who lived in a neighborhood next to Russian border were able to receive the analog Russian television, okay, from Russia. There was a spillover analog signal from Russia. And so what we're able to do, we're able to show that some of the people receive television pretty much for random reasons, depending on the local topography and the distance to the the TV broadcasting towers inside Russia. Okay, so what we've been able to do, we're able to compare, right, different political behaviors and attitudes of people who live close to each other, but some of them receive Russian television, some of them do not receive. So this gives us some sort of empirical leverage here. And so what we did, we collected data on polling station level results for what we call pro-Russian parties, basically the party of regions are now the opposition bloc, or all the presidential candidates like Yanukovych and the candidates who have more pro-Kremlin or pro-Moscow agenda. And then we did our own original survey of about 1,600 Ukrainians in that area, and we asked questions about their voting preferences, support for Maidan, trust in Putin, and their attitudes about the Donbass war. So what do we find? So let me give you a few results. So now on x-axis, what you have here, you have a quality with which you receive Russian television at a given village. Think about village or town. So at 0, that means there is a 0 chance that you will be able to watch Russian analog television. At about 0.2, according to this measure, you sort of will have very intermittent signal. It will depend on weather, it will depend on how good your antenna is, etc. After about 0.4, 0.6, to that range, you pretty have more or less stable signal. Around 0.8, you have a very stable signal. Okay, so you can watch it anytime you want. And on y-axis, you have pro-Russian votes, or votes for pro-Russian parties. So again, we just use it as mnemonic, pro-Russian parties, in the presidential elections of 2014. And so what we see, those areas, or those precincts that did not receive Russian television, the average support was around 24%, and it went all the way to around 35% in the areas that received very strong Russian TV signal. Now, you can ask, well, are these sizable effects? What does that mean? So we did the following calculation. We said, well, let's do the following computation. Let's calculate how much support pro-Russian parties would have lost if all of these areas that are colored here in dark would not be able to receive Russian television. Let's calculate that counterfactual. And so what we find is that pro-Russian parties would have received 6% fewer votes in that area in the parliamentary election, and 8% fewer votes in the presidential election. Okay, so these are quite sizable effects, but here's the more interesting part. We decided, okay, let's see if those effects of Russian media vary depending on the political configuration of a particular precinct. And so what we did, we collected data on the pro-Russian votes in each of the precincts in 2012, so that is before Crimea and Maidan. And then we report now also how the quality of Russian TV signal affects pro-Russian votes, but in 2 types of precincts. So one type of precinct is the precinct where in 2012 very heavily voted for pro-Russian parties at 80% levels. And another type of precinct is the precinct that had very low support for pro-Russian. So these are more pro-Western precincts, right? Only 20% of people in those precincts voted for pro-Russian parties in 2012. So what you see here is the following, right? So okay, so those precincts that were pro-Russian, of course, they started as more pro-Russian independently, whether they received Russian TV or not. But as you increase the quality of Russian TV signal, there were more and more votes going towards pro-Russian parties. Now, something different is happening when we look at the effects of quality of Russian TV signal in the areas that were actually more pro-Western. In those areas, we see a slight decrease of support for pro-Russian votes as a function of receiving Russian television. Okay? So you observe certain, what we call heterogeneity or diversity of these effects. So those effects are not really one-sided, right? And they depend on the composition, on the political composition of population. So we looked at with our survey, we looked at a couple of other things. We looked whether people who receive Russian, individuals who watch Russian television vote for pro-Russian parties, and we get the same result as we get with our polling station level analysis. Those individuals are about 43% more likely to think post-Maidan government was illegitimate. They're about 30% more likely to support Putin. And they about 17% more likely to think that Donbass war was caused by Maidan and USA, as opposed by Russia. Okay, so these are quite substantial effects on human attitudes, on the people's attitudes and behaviors. And they're also about 20% more likely to think that the Donbass war was punitive operation by the Ukrainian military forces. But now, the similar thing happens once we split individuals, right, in this analysis based on their linguistic preferences, which in Ukrainian context maps a lot into their political preferences. Okay, so for people who speak only Ukrainian, we observe very little effect of watching Russian television, and those effects are very, very sizable for people who speak only Russian, right? So again, the population is affected in very different ways. So what I want to just sort of to summarize the results that even conspicuously biased media can be persuasive. And so the aggregate effects of media really depend on how political priors are distributed in population. What I mean by this is the following. The area that we studied here is relatively pro-Russian, especially the Kharkiv region. If we now, it's possible to extrapolate, one has to be cautious, but it's possible to extrapolate and say, look, if people in Western Ukraine who are highly, anti-Russian, let's put it like this, would have been exposed to the same media, it would have generated on average a negative support, right? So in other words, it really depends who is exposed to that particular media source. So we cannot say that there's going to be one directional effect. But what we can say is that it's for sure, if you start in a society that is polarized, right, where people's preferences are already polarized, then you broadcast that media is going to lead to further polarization. At least one of the groups is going to move in one direction, or maybe both groups are going to be moving to separate directions. So that's definitely an effect. So I have some other things to say, but I see you are showing signs that...
Yeah, we want to keep some time for the discussion.
Okay, so I can stop here, or we can... Do you want me to stop here? I can stop here. I just have a few observations about a couple of things. What should I do?
Go wrap up.
Just very fast.
Yeah, the last.
Very fast. So these are not based on research. These are just my observations, and maybe we can discuss them. So I come from Lithuania, from the Baltic states, and we're talking about the Russia's informational campaigns way before you guys here in Washington D.C. started doing that. So basically, listen to us earlier, right? You can Russia a lot of time tests the strategies in Baltic states, in Caucasus, or in Ukraine. So it's sort of, we are patient zero. So it's important to observe what is happening in the vicinity. And when we started our project, like I live in New York City, so this is what we started seeing on Broadway, right, the billboards. So these were shown in the United States, right? And so the question on the right, the current debates, right, the current debates about the influence of Russian media are sort of interesting, and it's in the United States, interesting, and it's sort of difficult to make a conclusion about them. So, for example, you observe this tendency to state that to state that Russian media has almost this omnipotent effect, that it's everywhere, right? Like, for example, here's the graph shows that that 2.2 million of YouTube subscribers subscribe to RT Russia Today, right? Which is similar to CNN, right? And that in some sense should sort of evoke certain fear. Or, for example, that there were about 60,000 of Twitter posts generated by the Internet Research Agency of Russia, right? And so one way of looking into those things is to say, well, this is pretty bad. There's a very intense and persuasive effort to actually shift public opinion. So, but then I started looking into this, and I actually Googled, so what is the most subscribed YouTube channel? And the most subscribed YouTube channel is this guy. I don't know his name, but he basically plays video games online. Okay? And so he has 80 million subscribers, right? Versus 2.2 of RT today. So this is really, those 2.2 millions, right? It's really peanuts. It's really nothing in some sense. So that, if you look at RT today, the watching of the cable news of RT today, again, we keep hearing about it. And I actually wanted to do research in England whether what effect RT had on Brexit. And I started looking at numbers. And so these are the numbers of the monthly views of RT today. So this is between 0.0%. So this is 4% of 1% of all viewers in UK actually watch RT. Okay, so these are very meager numbers in some sense, right? And again, the Twitter thing and the bots, again, 60,000 posts. This is like a fraction of a daily, in 1 minute. There are more posts generated in 1 second or 1 minute on Twitter, right? So these are really, in some sense, this is one perspective one could take that, like, well, this is just drop in the bucket. Or, for example, right, so this is New York Times, these are people who surveyed the United States and then came up with the mastermind strategy of how to, create troll factories and shift the United States elections. And you look at this, like, really, these people? Like, it's a $6.6 billion industry, United States election. $6.6 billion industry. And we know from research, basically, that given all this money, still there is basically political campaigns have on average 0 effect. You cannot really switch people's opinions. And now these guys come here, 13 people, and they travel against the United States and come up with this mastermind strategy that shifts the public opinion and causes the change in the election. It's somewhat sort of incredible to me. So that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it, and this I'm going to finish very fast, Berlin, I'm sorry, is to think about what psychologists call third-person effect. So what is third-person effect? So there's a media source, and there are two possible people, two people who observe the media source, right? And the question is now, the media source can persuade them directly, but then each of those people will think, okay, wait a minute, maybe I wasn't persuaded, but what about this other guy? Because we always tend to think, look, I'm not the person who believes propaganda, but what if other people do? So in other words, media or propaganda more generally can be effective in changing behavior even if it doesn't persuade them, even if it's not widely spread. And here's an example that Philip Davidson, a psychologist who developed this theory of third-person effect, gave the following example from Second World War. So this is the war with Japan, right, in Iwo Jima. So what happens, there was a platoon of African-American soldiers over there, and so Japanese start dropping flyers that tell them, don't risk your life for the white man, give up yourself at the first opportunity, just desert, don't take chances. Okay, so what happens then? The person who observes this says, look, this thing, it didn't convince anyone. But here's what happened. The military authorities decided for themselves that, well, people are going to be convinced, they are going to desert. So therefore, the next day the unit was withdrawn. So what was the intention of Japanese? The intention of Japanese, they did not expect to convince the platoon, but they expected others to think that platoon will be convinced. That's the third-person effect. And I think a lot of things that when we talk about Russian media, really has this flavor that we tend to inflate their effect ourselves by always talking about how omnipotent it is. So there are these direct and indirect effects, right? And when we talk about, wow, RT has 2.2 million subscribers, right? That just inflates this indirect third-person effect. So we really, in part, if there is an influence of Russian media, it's really, a lot of it is self-inflicted. That's my view. I don't have proof of that. Again, this is a speculative thing. And yeah, I think I'm going to finish here. Because Berlin is
Thank you so much, Arthur, for this really fascinating presentation. Now I would like to open the floor for some questions, comments. Please introduce yourself. Don't be shy. I'm sure there are several questions. Yeah.
I had a quick question. Bob Ortang here at GTW. You showed RT effects on UK, but if you look at the RT internationally, their biggest audiences are actually in Latin America and Arabic-speaking countries. So I wonder if you're not really cherry-picking your data, because showing RT effects in UK is pretty minimal. I mean, by any standard, they have, like you said, a very small audience. It's hard to get a hold of them. But what the real impacts are, and this, sort of the countries that are not Western or not Eastern, kind of that are sort of the combat zones of the old Cold War, and that's where they're really targeting the audience.
Right, so again, just to make sure what I was saying here, I was trying to present two views on the same phenomenon, right? One view being that, well, let's all start panicking about the pervasive volumes, right, of Russian media, including RT today. And there were observations made, for example, with respect to Brexit, right, that, well, part of the campaign was actually done on RT, and RT was very much in favor on Brexit, right? And so, of course, I'm not, so that's one perspective. What I'm saying is, like, look, at least when it comes to these particular instances, I don't see much evidence that there could have been a massive direct effect because of this low spread, right, or low pickup rates of those media sources, right? So if there were effects, they were effects of this third-person effect type of nature, where people's campaign strategies, right, and their political narrative was changed because they expected that RT is going to influence certain people. Now, of course, that doesn't mean anything, that doesn't mean at all that RT doesn't have influence outside those particular domains, right? Obviously, that probably is not the case, and I know that the pickup rates in Latin America are much, much bigger, and there was a concerted effort actually to get to that particular point. but I haven't studied that, and I don't want to speculate on that point. But of course, the point is well taken. That of course, I can defend on the information that I presented. The information I presented was on the effects in Western world. Yes, I think you have a follow-up, right?
Well, yeah, just a quick follow-up. Like, do you know who the audience is when you're looking at these? Because if the audience is just marginal people who don't have any impact on just some extreme,
Oh yeah, okay.
extreme groups, or if the audience is some like kind of networkers
Yeah.
who might be transmitting this information on.
So I don't know I don't think that I haven't seen the actual like research that would point out who those people are. But here's a couple of interesting things. So the only analog transmitter in the United States, guess where the analog transmitter in the United States is located that transmits RT? That's in Virginia. And so it covers DC area.
But
Okay?
no longer.
No longer. Maybe
It's
no.
gone.
Last time I checked, it was there. So, but the only one that existed, it was there, right? And so the head of RT today was actually once when she was praising themselves, right, about how successful they are and how big their numbers are. She said, look, a lot of people, Western establishment, people who see as enemies, they actually watch RT today. And I think that's the reason for that is the third person effect, which is like, I want to know what other people, not like myself, more persuadable people will be convinced by, so let me watch and see. So there's part of that. But my own impression, without doing any research, is I think that it does pick up more extreme elements on society and on both sides, on both left and right. And I just infer it just from the coverage of the things that they do cover, right? Especially in the United States, like it's all about police brutality, about racism, right? Environmental issues. So all, extreme left and extreme right. And if you actually look what people comment on their videos, it also comes out pretty clear. But again, that's I don't have systematic research. So I think it's really policymakers and extremists. I think that's the constituency.
There was a second question, yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Oates from University of Maryland and the Wilson Center. So, yeah, you kind of shot yourself in the foot because every time I had a question, you answered it with the next slide. But I still have questions, and I think this work is just really great, particularly evolving coding so that you're using a classifying machine classifying. So I have one practical question and one kind of more existential question. Where did you get the transcripts? Just downloaded from the website, or?
Yeah, so in 2016, I haven't checked right now, but in 2016, they were all in the archive of RT1.
Okay.
Yeah, an online archive.
Yeah, I've downloaded some random stuff, but
Yeah.
I think it's very good,
Yeah.
good systematic. And I thought you made, so this is the existential question. You made a really good point about the Baltic states, that the Baltic states, this is, again, an existential question for the Baltic states. This is not some academic, scholarly question for them about Russian influence. Can the United States learn anything from the Baltic experience well, I don't know if I'll speak to Lithuania or to also Latvia and Estonia. What should we be doing or not doing, maybe?
So, I don't know what exactly, so I had the last point about what we should be doing more in terms of research to learn these things, but I think my point about Baltic states is that we can learn about strategies that Russia is going to be using elsewhere before they are used elsewhere.
And they do
So
that,
the way,
okay.
when we wrote our paper about Ukraine, we sort of kept saying that, look, a lot of these strategies, right, of divide and conquer and present their extreme views, right, that the Ukraine was pretty much like patient zero, given the scale of those particular campaigns. So if you want to learn how something, develops, you have to go to patient zero. Or if you want to see early signs, right, you go to patient zero. So that's my point. Now, what exactly ought to be done? I think that's an entirely different question. I really think that we have no good research about counter-propaganda measures. That's my view on this.
Well, I also would say, and I'll let someone else ask, I would also say that the issues in Lithuania, where you do have a population that is native speaker of Russian, is very, very different from the issues, say, in the United States. So, yeah, it's challenging.
Yes. Hi, Will Beebe with the State Department. I have a similar question, but I want to phrase it a different way that maybe you can throw some insight at. So instead of how to counter propaganda, what would you say is the best way to increase costs on the Russian state that would say, let's not put out as much disinformation in Latin America or against the United States in elections. Do you think there's a way to play to the Russian mindset that I'm sure you're more familiar with, that says knock it off?
I mean, so here's the difficult part. Like, I feel comfortable talking about things that I've researched directly, right? And this is some sort of an interesting policy counterfactual. So the only thing probably this is very tough. Like, how do you constrain when the government establishes an agency to produce information, right? That agency has its own incentive to do it, whether something is effective or not effective. But I think the part that does incentivize the creation of these, internet research agencies and similar things. But I think the mindset that does help with that is the mindset that we have right now, where we are very, I wouldn't say hysterical, but we are really have very heightened emotions when it comes to influence of Russian media.
Yes.
The source of its strength is really, look how different it is. So China, right? China has a very very elaborate CCTV network in Africa, right? China, builds ports and gets rights to store the army units across all parts of the world, and they do it silently. They don't put it under the magnifying glass. They don't scream around. Really the Russian influence here is it comes from the fact that we are always emphasizing how influential we are. If we did less of that, I think it would constrain the behavior. I don't have research for that, but that's my sort of impression. The strength is not coming from the real direct persuasive effects of the media campaigns that they're doing. The strength comes from the fact that we interpret those media campaigns as being effective. Again, I think through the third person logic. So they thrive on the fact that we talk about them as being effective. No one knows if they're really effective. We don't really have good measures and tools to do that. But it's enough for us to say that they are, and that's what they're going to do. So I think I don't know how to constrain ourselves right now and not get hysterical when someone posts a tweet. I don't know how to do that.
Does that happen in Lithuania? Or Lithuania is smarter about that?
So, yeah, I think there is a bit more measured response to these things. Yes, there's never really a massive public campaigns that people would outcry and say, on a mass scale that, look, Russia has this, has decided election. I think, again, my impression, people would say, they tried to do it, but here you sort of went off the hook, I think, in America, where you start saying, they decided election. What else do you want them to do? How else can you constrain them if you tell them that they were effective, right? Without the evidence. Yes, please. Oh, sorry. I'm not
No. Peter first and then.
Yeah, I'm Peter Wolbach, Director of IRIS, and in many cases, many of your statements I actually nodded and thought this is exactly what should have been said long ago, actually, about the influence and the real influence of RT. I have to admit, I've been an avid RT watcher over years, and even when people thought, oh, how can you do that? And, yes, sir, indeed, yes. So I'm not afraid to say that. But, the reality, that's why I impolitely interrupted you with one said no longer, right? So about a year and a half ago, all these stations, that is RT, France 24, the Chinese stations, so they all were taken off air here. So you cannot watch them any longer. You have to go to YouTube to actually see them, or directly, online. But when you go to YouTube, you can see that the number of clicks is very low. It's about 35,000, which is really nothing. It's really a very low percentage. So I think what happened was that we had, on the one hand, an inflated sense of danger, because it came from Russia, and Russia became this real catchword in internal U.S. debates about who won the election, who influenced it, and so on, who colluded with whom, and that's why we have congressional reports and intelligence reports that say RT did this, RT did that, and then in reality, I agree completely that if you measure it more exactly, it's impossible to see any effect. And then the other question, of course, is which are the viewers that regularly watch them? That would be a real interesting question to ask, to see maybe actual cases of viewers groups that regularly watch these programs. So my question is, isn't it true that this, or would you consider, this is something that hasn't been said, that this whole issue of the influence of Russian media on American minds, American elections, and so on, has become an issue for inner American discourses. So that, because you could say, well, now you're saying exactly what RT is saying, basically, identifying somebody's opinion with a Russian opinion, which of course would be the enemy opinion, right? So I think the reason why this tale of this incredible Russian influence of Russian media has been maintained has to do with its effectiveness in inner U.S. political discourses, rather than in real facts.
But I mean, that didn't happen on an empty space. I think there are some important tectonic shifts in politics now everywhere, and they were able to get the narrative just right for just right group of people, and sort of then it spiraled out. I think that's sort of, they were good at that. That's definitely the case.
There was a lady there. Oh.
Hello, yes, great presentation, Megan Cohesi, German Marshall Fund. I just wanted to go back to your model for a second. I was wondering how might future research add the dimension of extremism and terrorist threats when analyzing political disinformation, since President Putin and Russian media have often used terrorism as the scapegoat for which to inflate bad news or to make themselves look better as protectorates. Would that be part of the foreign powers aspect of the model, or would that be its own dimension?
So you mean domestic terrorism, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that we didn't really look into that particular category. Then probably you could do that. I mean, and this I wouldn't classify it as a foreign thing. I would classify it as domestic, but domestic non-governmental, right? You could also think attribution of bad news to the vicious activities of opposition, right, and things like that, and the fifth column and things like that. That would be domestic in that sense, but it still would not assign direct responsibility to Putin or his officials, right? So yes, I think that would be consistent.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I was just struck a minute ago in some of the exchanges we were having that as someone who's sort of followed the question of Russian influence for a while now, the conversation to me seems to have dramatically moved away from RT and toward the other half of the campaign you mentioned, the online campaign. And there have been academics and computer scientists who have tried to quantify the impact of that campaign through a variety of mechanisms. I wondered if you would engage with that at all in order to see if, and then the second thing I would note on that front is also that the one thing they did that I think you can, that inarguably move the needle was to steal a bunch of campaign materials and put them on the internet and get it on the front page of the New York Times. And so there's another piece of these campaigns that I think has to be considered before you can talk about impact.
Yeah, so look, so there's there are different aspects here. So there's this very sort of engineering aspect. If they just manage to stumble upon the probe of data, right, and they leak it, that's not like a sustainable everyday strategies. They just happen to be, engineering. They just happen to put themselves in a situation. You cannot treat a hack as a consistent everyday strategy of the media, right?
Well,
It happened, but I think we can sort of analyze that thing separately from overall sort of media campaign. I think that's the first thing. And the former thing that you said about the online, I think so. Look, I haven't done. My research is not online, and I come from NYU, and we have the social media and political participation lab that is actually doing a lot of interesting research on Russia's influence online. And so they are still not at the point where they would be able to identify the effects of, let's say, bots generated from Russia, but they're able to measure the bot behavior. And it's pretty astounding. They do it for Russia only and for Ukraine. So inside Russia, it turns out in some time periods of time, more than 50% of all the material is actually bot-generated material. We don't know how effective it is because a lot of it is just really, really garbage stuff. It's like a bot that you see is a bot, right? So I don't know. I think that this is where next stage of research inevitably is going to move, and that's going to be the most interesting part. But that's not my research, so I cannot really give a qualified assessment. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center. Going back to your first two points about treatment of economic news and political news, is there research on? So this is Moscow TV1. Is there research on how that plays out in the Baltic states, where the Russian-speaking population is tuned, as I understand it, most of all to central Moscow television? And, you know, is there any sort of manipulative effort to target specifically the Russian populations in the Baltic states? Or is there any research
So
on
I
that?
haven't, so this is, I don't know if it's embarrassing or not, so I'm from there, but I haven't really researched
Okay.
the discourse of Russian TV stations broadcasted in Baltic states. But I would presume there are some similar spillovers in the narrative, and I don't think that would be, in a sense, similar that, you know, good news to Putin, bad news to somebody else, but I think there would be other dimensions, like, for example, you know, critique of European Union, the social issues, gay rights, and I think that would be resonated, I would imagine, from my very cursory experience, that would be resonated in those media sources over there. So not necessarily economic part of the narrative,
Mhm.
but social issues narrative, I would say yes, probably.
Well, on that, it's already time for us
All right.
to
Thank
stop,
you.
so please join me.